Welcome to the Enneagram with Chelsea and Nicole. This is a positively deviant culture podcast anchored in the Enneagram. And in this episode, we're talking about the paradoxes of the six. I'm smiling and chuckling a little bit because this is probably my most anticipated aspect of this six conversation because there are so many paradoxes. We talked a little bit already around the complexity of the six, their ability to reach into more of the other types, but they're the ultimate paradoxical type. A couple of things I'll just tee up this conversation with. Sometimes they can be experienced like a ping pong ball. And then this one I really liked. A bundle of opposites is their fingerprint. So Nicole, how would you start us off thinking about the duality within the type six?
The simplest way to describe it is that there's just that much complexity where everything is occurring at the same time in the minds and in the hearts of sixes. And so it's in many ways they're unpredictable and yet we're all kind of more predictable, particularly in our stress responses. But the core of sixes is their access, the ability to have access to more parts of our humanity than anyone else. And as a result of that, it gives them an enormous amount of access to skills and to, all the things that humans need. It also makes it confusing and difficult and stressful. And so when you see sixes, in all of this complexity and inside the kind of the for and against is kind of the way that I describe sixes is that they'll go towards and then away. And so you used ping pong. That feels more intense, I suppose. But I kind of experience sixes going toward and away, toward and away. They'll come towards something that they think is good and believable and credible, and then, but also away because they're uncertain and it's not confirmed. And what they're looking for is what is trustworthy information and trustworthy people. So, that was kind of just naming a couple of the areas of complexity and a little bit naming the paradox of that, that they're both and they're kind of the ultimate representative of all things at once. And I actually love this space in terms of just the metaphor, the symbolism of being both and all the simultaneity is real. And so I like it that six kind of sit at this place.
It's like their vetting process. I'm just going to kind of fire out several of the paradoxes and then we'll keep unpacking them. They worship authority. They fear it. We already talked about courage and the counterbalance of cowardice. Obedience, disobedience. Fearing aggression, being highly aggressive. Jump in and stop me if you want to add a point on any of these. I just have a couple of more. Valuing security and then feeling insecure. Being really likable and endearing. And also, on the flip side, can be mean and hateful, which are pretty strong words. In some ways, want to escape punishment. In other ways, bring it on themselves. Can feel and experience themselves as both strong and weak, fearful and courageous, trusting and distrusting, defenders and also provokers. I have kind of a byline for us to come back to the push and pull that you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Sweet and sour, bullies and weaklings, on the defensive and sometimes on the offensive. Thinkers and doers, group people and soloist. We talked about that in the first part of this sixth episode. Definitely believers and doubters. I will stop there because skepticism is a word or even a behavior that's come up a lot in my experience with sixes. And it's like they're really skeptical until you're in, and then the belief is there. And that's why I think they get the name the loyalist. So I'll pause there and get your reaction to that. If you would even adjust any of what I've shared.
Yeah, no, I mean, that list is actually, just a good list. And I think that to be fair, all humans experience that, right? It's like, as you're going through the list, like I could relate to most of that too. And you should too, to some degree, Chelsea, because humans are never one thing and we can't be reduced to a title or any list, right? That none of us can be reduced. And that's what I love that sixes show us. So sixes capture such the complexity and wholeness of humanity that we can all relate to. I think that just in certain instances, it's more extreme in the sense of how they're experiencing that. And so with that said, I have a couple paradoxes that I think are the most important. And I think that one is this gift that they have around prescience is the ability to predict what could go wrong. And I think this is so tied to their brilliance. But then in a stress response, all of us go to the things that we're gifted with, the things that we're good at. We go to our strengths. Of course, it's a very intelligent strategy when shit is hitting the fan or when we're feeling stressed out or when we have deep concerns. Well, of course, we're going to just naturally go to the things that we're good at and we're going to execute based on our strengths because that's pretty smart strategy, even if unconscious. So what that looks like, however, in sixes specifically, and this is why we all have these paradoxes, is that for sixes is that when they're stressed out, they will actually see things that aren't there. In other words, they will start identifying problems that are not there. And again, this is coming from their strength. So when they're integrated, they can actually see the problems that are present and they can identify with accuracy points of failure, particular risks. And of course, their predictive abilities are very accurate. And then what happens when we misapply them and where we're not in a state where we lose accuracy, we just miss the mark. And so we're misusing our strengths and then it goes in the opposite direction, which is the paradox. And so what sixes will experience is the sky is falling, everything's wrong. It'll go to paranoia and deep anxiety of just they're seeing all kinds of things or even creating problems that aren't there. So that's the paradox. But what I love about knowing that is that when you have the sixes in your life, for me, when I see a six kind of spiraling into their negativity and the sky is falling and we're all going to die, is there's a way to be super compassionate and understanding because of course sixes are going to do that. There isn't a six who doesn't. And so now we can just understand where that's coming from and support them in actually locating the source of their anxiety and dealing with that, instead of spiraling into an activity trying to solve for their anxiety. So we can help them actually consciously figure out what is actually concerning them and then creating a specific strategy for which they can address that. What do you think about that, Chelsea?
Absolutely. If you're standing by a six from the outside looking in, you're seeing the sixes are anticipating the worst case scenario because that's what they're designed to do. And that's a real gift when applied correctly. But when it's not applied correctly and the sky is falling, and then the defense mechanism of projection, sometimes they can project it against others as like it's their unconscious motive. And so this is where I think compassion comes in. We've talked about compassion, some of the general intro conversations, and how an awareness of what's happening and why it's happening for someone can really allow us to partner with them in a much more compassionate way. And so when you start talking about trying to unpack that uncertainty and understand what's driving it, that's a really supportive thing to do. Also taking into account how strongly this type is predetermined to feel these things. And so we can cherish that as a gift and then also help walk back from the edge of the cliff a little bit. When you talked about building strategies, this is a really great example to showcase the type of work that can be done when you understand someone's operating type. It becomes very practical in that sense. So a little bit off the side there, but did want to make that point because it's exactly the nature of how we partner using the Enneagram, right?
Yeah. And I think the reason why I kind of point out it's such a theme of mine is to locate and point out the paradoxes because, well, humans are full of them. We are. And I think the more atypical we become and even more well-developed we become, those paradoxes increase. We become everything at the same time, which is awesome. But in a very kind of momentary way in ourselves and in our relationships, if we can see that some of the negative things we are experiencing are an absolute result as a source from the ways that we're designed. And it's coming from our brilliance. We're just misusing it because we're stressed out or because we're disintegrated. And so understanding that, just one, like you just said, and I'll reiterate, because it's really important, is to be, compassionate to ourselves and others. And then two, there's an actual way that we can get through it. And I think that's the way, is starting to realizing where it's coming from and what are the things that are underneath it that we're actually trying to meet what is the need that we're actually trying to meet? And how can we help ourselves and others meet that, or decide that that need is not as important as other things are in the moment? And again, it's all about creating a priority and strategy and to a certain degree, a plan.
This is not to one size fits all people's personalities. It's an invitation to almost battle with the complexities of life.
Yes, totally.
And invite more of them and unpack them, but through understanding the core motivation, not through just the behavior itself. And we talked about this a little bit at the end of the last episode, where sixes really want to know what's coming, to get the information so that they can be successful. And they long for this certainty. Would you add to that? Or
well, really, the way that I kind of engage this is comparing the types and how they're both important. And this is why we need each other. So sixes in their design is ultimately they're trying to be prepared. And knowing is very important to being prepared and very important to avoiding catastrophe. And having as much information as possible in order to have the accurate analytics and in order to develop a plan and then a backup plan and then a backup plan to the backup plan, which is what sixes are often up to. And so because of that, there is this drive. And also security is largely connected to a sense of certainty. What other types teach us, though, is that there is no security. That the amount of security that actually exists in the world is quite minimal. And we do, as humans, need a certain amount of security to survive. Ultimately, and this is coming from me, and since I'm an 8, I kind of reject the idea of a certainty and security. To me, that is something that isn't as real as the fact that anything could be taken away from us at any time. And as an 8, I hold the paradox of having the ultimate agency and personal power, and yet also able to understand that I have no power at all. That there are certain forces that are beyond any individual power that is just is. And so there's two things that are simultaneously true. And in that reality, 8s teach us what I think 6s need to learn, which is 1, our personal power, that in a moment we have the ability and agency to do it. And 6s actually, and this is what I remind 6s, that in a moment of crisis, who they are is what prepares them. It's not that they've actually written out a plan and gathered all the data. It's just them living their lives. They're doing that. They're already doing that. They're already noticing things. They're already observing things that the rest of us are not. They're already prepared. And so this is kind of an element of the paradox that I remind 6s of, is that everything that you are wanting or needing or prioritizing, you already are. And that is the paradox for all of us. And so 6s, and this is again like all of us, but 6s are kind of whipping up their own anxieties and fears because they're worried that they don't have what they need. And we're here to say and remind 6s that you already do. And this is a very interesting paradox, that out of all of humanity on the planet, you are naturally more skilled and capable of meeting a moment of disaster or threat or anything that's going wrong than the rest of us. It's just, you're forgetting that. You're not as connected to that.
It applies to the 6, but I also hear undertones that, the point is not that we're all already these perfect, fully integrated into our type and beyond people. We're human beings. And so the opportunity for 6 is to be fully your 6 self, like with these natural gifts and dispositions. And I think that that's the same charge for each type, to lean into the essence that is already present naturally,
yes,
and to grow and develop more of that. And it's so interesting because we're all out there trying to get more of what we think we need, and we have it within us. So it's the out there trying to get more of what we think we need that oftentimes creates these problems, right? Because it's overusing the gifts that we already have.
Exactly. This, if anything, and if anyone could take away anything regarding the wisdom of the Enneagram, I suppose it would be this, is that we as individuals, whatever type we are already are that which we are seeking. And 6 is the invitation and the reminder is to trust yourself. There's every reason, which we have mapped out to a large part, of why you are trustworthy and credible human beings worthy of trusting yourself. And I would. You know what I mean? That's what I said in the beginning. It's like, look, if there's like a certain moment of crisis, like I'm going to look to where my sixes are, and I fully trust that they're going to figure out something better than me, because that's their core design, even without trying. I mean, and so then if you're a well-developed six, you're going to just be all that more accurate and more advanced in doing your job better. And I mean that, you know, metaphorically, doing your job in the world, you know, metaphorically. And I suppose, you know, this is something that eights teach us, is to trust yourself. Like ultimately, eights out of all the types trust themselves more than anything else, more than other people, or more than anything external, anything. And then, you know, misused, that's not great. That's an overtrust, you know, in ways that you need to depend on others. But so eights can remind sixes in this way, which is, I love the combination, is that, you know, sixes can trust yourself. And there's all this absolute credible evidence of how you're trustworthy.
And instead, oftentimes when people aren't fully integrated or fully developed, or in moments, right? This is not like once you get to the next level, you stay there. We've talked a little bit about how in one moment you can be really well developed, really healthy, and then in a moment of stress, completely fall apart. And that's the human condition. But the interesting thing is that sixes can trust themselves, and they're often absolutely riddled with anxiety over what is the answer.
Yeah. Inside this paradox, there could be a fixation on details and information. And really what that is just indicating is that it's what's controllable. You know, the details are places that you can see and what's controllable. And the problem with that is that the sixes lose altitude, you know, is the way I say it, is that they get overly bogged down in the details and analysis paralysis, right? Like the sixes are the most prone, humans are prone to this, but sixes the most to analysis paralysis. So sixes in a stress response, if they can recognize, and this is the point, when we recognize our stress responses, we can see what we're doing and we can pull out. And part of pulling out for sixes is realizing that they're in a stress response, and then realizing that it's going to be okay because they can trust themselves. And sixes are generally looking for others and looking outside of themselves for safety, security, and trustworthiness, instead of realizing that they are their own security. And this is kind of the deep spaces that I think are deeply inspiring and powerful, is that sixes don't need anyone else. They are their own security. They are trustworthy, reliable, and they know how to be supportive. They understand what guidance looks like. They can be that for themselves. That's the kind of journey for sixes to deeply realize and accept. And we each have one similar.
Yeah.
The call is, you know, for sixes to trust themselves and to realize that they are their own security, that they don't need to look outside of themselves, that they already have the very thing they desire most.
We haven't talked much about the fact that the six resides in the head space. And so
that's true.
I want to tee up sixes being in their heads and the opportunity to get out of their head and into their body, to get grounded, to get present, to stop the catastrophizing defaults. So yeah, talk to us about the six and being in their head.
I'm always one to push back on the popular language of getting out of your head, or you can't. I mean, it's like telling, like it too, Chelsea, like you can't just get out of your feel, like you can't just flip the switch. And I don't like it when, you know, people say that of the heart center. It's like, well, just stop feeling, you know, why are you so, you know, whatever, just, it's like, no, there's no light switch. You are. So what I think that is useful is realizing that there are centers of intelligence. There's the mind is a center of intelligence. The heart is one, and the body is one, and we need all of them. So it's less about getting out of your center and more about learning how to leverage your own intelligence better, and how to lean on other centers of intelligence, like the body and the heart. And just because you're thinking doesn't necessarily mean you're in your mind. And just because you're feeling doesn't mean you're in your heart. And just because you're moving your body doesn't mean you're in your body. You know what I mean? So the nuance here, and I'm kind of speaking poetically, is that there's incarnation or embodiment or incorporation, whatever word you want to use, is a journey. And we can't just decide to get out of where we are. I mean, maybe some people can for certain moments, and I don't want to be overly, authoritative on this, but I'm pushing back and resisting a lot of the popular language around, discipline and will and all that. And sure, okay, there's certain circumstances that might be beneficial, but I think that's more powerful in my experience with working with so many people is letting that be and just learning to gather more tools and learning how to use your best tool better.
Yeah. Well, I think the journey is to start with self-awareness. And so for sixes to know that maybe they spend more time in the thinking triad than in some of the other parts of the body, the heart or the body, starting from that place allows them to then access those other places with more intentionality.
Well, I think what's interesting because even as you're speaking, like, I actually don't know if that's true. Like sixes they are lodged they're very much in the mind center. But out of all the types, because they actually have more access to everyone else, they are very much in their heart and very much in their body. Most sixes I know are pretty balanced in their mind, body, heart in terms of how they experience the world and how they're actually living inside it. So I think that the places that end up causing them the most pain is probably right at their anxiety and fears. And that does exist in the mind. In many ways, though, how I work with sixes is using their mind, depending and leaning into their skills to actually get out of it. And I even don't like that language of that places are necessary to get out of, but more of maybe relieving or seeing a bigger landscape so that you can locate yourself with more accuracy. And it's changing that perspective in a way that actually makes certain experiences change. The results of the shifts are what we start naming as goals. And so I want to be careful about that it's like, getting out of something that, we name it as a goal. But really getting out and what we're talking about is the result of many other things that we're doing. To try to use that as a goal, we end up trying to do all these tips and tricks and try this and try that. And oftentimes it makes it worse. So what I usually do with sixes is actually just going with it. Like, hey, okay, you have anxiety, fear. Let's figure out what it is. And usually it's that process in itself that helps reduce the anxieties, because once it's actually located, that makes it better right there. Then we can figure out what to do with it, because usually for sixes and for most humans, it's a combination of things. It's not one thing. Sometimes it's one thing, but usually it's a combination of things. And then we can start working with, well, okay, what is most important to you is one conversation. And then also the other conversation is which one of these are actually real and what are we kind of making up? And that process is we actually go through and, say, okay, well, if this is one, then let's really look at that. Let's examine that. Here's a potential outcome. Is that possible? And I'll go through their same process of what they do in their mind with them. And we'll determine, oh, that's actually not very likely. That's actually not going to be the result. Okay, great. We've eliminated that one. Let's go to the next. And that's actually a process of the mind. Oddly.
And you can walk through this here because of the courage that they have to hold this space and the willingness to go through it.
For certain circumstances and certain fears, we'll need to go to the heart or the body or whatever. But I think that the reality is, Chelsea, for all of us, the hope and the path of growth is to become more balanced in all of it. But that's a pretty big thing to do. So where we start is usually with something acute, unfortunately. And then how we actually manage that acute situation really depends on the context and the circumstance. But like I'm saying, oftentimes with sixes, it really is actually using their mind and not, asking them to go take a run, even though that's a great thing too, that helps, right? Like for all of us, anxiety. Yeah, sure. We definitely getting into our body. And if we're not doing that, well, then, we're not going to be a very balanced human being. But I don't know how that would be any different for a six than it would be for the rest of us, is my point.
It's interesting that you mentioned your experience working with sixes is that they actually potentially represent some of the most equilibrium or balance across the thinking, heart, and the body triads because of the way that the triangle is positioned. So stop me if this is completely off, but I believe that those three numbers, 6, 9, and 3, are the only numbers that intersect with one from each triad. The other ones might have an integration point within their triad and then one kind of across the landscape. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's true. Without getting into more complexity around it, to kind of stick to 6s in particular, is that 6s usually, like when I'm going through the process of helping them identify their type, they'll usually think that they're heart type more often than not. Many 6s will, be very clear that they're head type. But I'm going to say probably 50% of the 6s think they're heart types, like right out of the gate. And that kind of just goes to show that they actually are experiencing, a lot of heart stuff and very connected, to their hearts. And in my experience with 6s myself, I can really see that. Yeah. They're not afraid of expressing emotion or experiencing emotion.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's so key. I mean, we're not here to give answers, right? This conversation is really just to unpack bit by bit this deep levels of a complexity and all those nuances. And before we wrap up, just to know that our next conversation is really around how we can lean into 6s and all their strengths. So what we've just demonstrated as the power and the gifts of the 6. Is there anything else around the paradox that you want to make sure we leave listeners with today?
Again, this is why we chose the 6, the most complex type. I think that they really create a beautiful landscape for our own humanity. Like all of us can find ourselves in the 6 because that's where they kind of are. And so I think that in terms of paradox, they kind of represent all of it. And I like that. Like, I love that. Like, this is something that's deeply important to me. Is I think so much of what the 6s represent, of the messiness, the complexity, the uncertainty, and a certain kind of fragility that 6s aren't afraid of. And again, I think that's a place of courage. And so the kind of depth, that courage that is, man, that 6s have is deeply inspiring to me. And I suppose, that belongs in context of my 8 self, of being fearless and realizing it is not the same, that courage is a far deeper virtue than fearlessness. And so I think that that's one of the big things I want everyone to take away is that the goal isn't to be disconnected to your fear. It's actually being connected to your fear, and like 6s are, and then being courageous inside it and not let it stop you, and working it out and being in, all of the elements of our humanity. And 6s really do. They're the center of all of the human stuff. And so thank you to the 6s in the world for holding all of that and for keeping humanity alive.
And as promised, we have no easy, quick fixes here. So continue to, listen and engage with us to explore more of the complexities of life. This is really an invitation. We're on our own personal journey of learning, and we invite you to join us and share your thoughts and get in touch via LinkedIn. And in our next episode, we're going to be talking about how we can leverage 6s in all of that courageous badassness, and then also how they're misunderstood and they can be experienced in the world in ways that don't hold the magnificence or the incredible virtues that they really do encompass. So thanks for listening.
Bye, everyone.